Прежде всего, позвольте сказать большое спасибо за приглашение и за возможность взять участие в такой большой конференции. And now I would like to take you to the territory situated between the river Oder and the river Vistula on the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, which have been referred to in historical sources as Pomerania. It means the land on the sea. Since the 7th century, it was the territory settled by West Slavonic tribes. Still is discussing the emergence of Slavs on the Baltic Sea, their local or non-local origin. That is very important also in my study on the oldest leather shoes in Pomerania region. There are two main opinions. First, Slavs appeared in Baltic Sea in the 6th or 7th century. And second, the Germanic population remaining in this area after great migrations. I will not develop this discussion, but it is necessary to say that in the light of nowadays interpretation, we should consider third opinion about intermediate link between the disappearance of cultures with late Roman features and the emergence of communities associated with the Slavs. Please next. What about footwear? We have no traces of leather production from the oldest phase of the Middle Age in Pomerania. I mean from 6th, 7th century. In the late 8th and early 9th century, the oldest trade and craftwork centers, so-called emporium or civitas, began to take shape in Pomerania, which were connected with far-reaching exchange of goods with the areas so distant as Scandinavia or Russia or Constantinople and Arabic countries. The active participation of Pomeranian inhabitants in the creation of this economic specific zone gave fruits in the form of adapting foreign cultural elements and some technical skills, as well as ideas and culture patterns facilitating the unification of the Baltic zone societies. The crucial point in the Pomeranian medieval history was 12th century. First, because of introduction of Christianity, and second, because of a wider opening to Western Europe. The end of early Middle Ages in Pomerania was connected with town locations about mid-13th century in German law. The end of Middle Age and the beginning of post-medieval period was connected with Reformation in 16th century. Next, please. In my studies of technological transformations in the history of medieval leatherworking, especially footwear, I used sources from well-dated cultural contexts in main Pomeranian towns like Szczecin, Kołobrzeg, Wolin, and Gdańsk. The large amounts and chronological range of Pomeranian finds made me to take up a subject that had not been studied before in Poland. In my area of interest were the beginnings of shoemaking based on finds from Wolin. This was the first step towards studying the genesis of sole elements and the beginnings of shoemaking as an organized activity, a precursor of the late medieval craftsmanship corporations. A separate group of my research issues is related to the stylistic variability of footwear and in its relationships with clothing and outfit, as well as transformations taking place under the influence of the developments of skills, techniques, and technologies, and of course, external inspiration, aesthetic preferences, and finally, starting in 12th century, also fashion. The beginning of organized leatherworking, including footwear in the Baltic Sea, should be sought in the oldest craft and trade centers scattered along trade routes leading from north to south and from west to east. In my opinion, at the time when a new quality of economic life was being created in the Baltic part of Barbaricum, associated with long-distance trade, along with the formation of crafts and produced spectacular luxury goods, the foundations for the development of shoemaking were laid as a specialized craft serving anonymous customers. The biggest problem in studying the origins of footwear and shoemaking in general is the scarcity of sources. I am sure that one of the richest and best preserved collections of footwear from the early Middle Ages in the Baltic Sea was obtained during excavations in Wolin. The main aim of my research on leather production in Wolin was to distinguish the oldest elements of footwear which developed later in the centuries, to outline the directions of its development, manufactured techniques and forms, and to answer the question whether in the period of cultural unification in the area around the Baltic, one can point the features typical to a specific center be distinguished. This issue is also related to the continuity of cultural process dating back to prehistoric times and the transfer and absorption of foreign patterns. The oldest shoe finds in Northern and Western Europe are dated back to the Bronze and early Iron Ages. Primitive forms are known from the marshes of Scandinavia and northern Germany. Their common feature is that they are made entirely of a single piece of leather and that they have a strap to join the edges of leather together. In the early Middle Ages, this archaic type of footwear, which clearly served only to protect the feet, was replaced by one-piece shoe of more sophisticated construction. It means diversified shape and use of plant threads instead leather straps. Next, please. Until now, the early medieval one-piece forms have not been the subject of separate research in Poland. In general, they were considered to be the oldest early medieval footwear, which over time was replaced by multi-part forms. However, the result of my research on this issue suggests that both types appear together. Also, one-piece forms clearly have been divided into archaic, typically prehistoric, and more technically and stylistically advanced, which have later led to the development of multi-piece footwear. Next, please. Probably the oldest advanced one-piece Pomeranian footwear comes from Wolin. It means that the end of 8th century. On the other hand, the most archaic one-piece footwear, referring most fully to the bog finds from northern Germany and Scandinavia, is represented by the model found in Szczecin, in layer dated to the 9th century. This type of footwear should be considered as traditional, not requiring special skills and performing strictly utilitarian functions. In the case of Szczecin, new forms, which I defined as advanced, appeared together with economic changes resulting from the inclusion of this center in the long-distance trade around the Baltic Sea. It should be noticed that archaic one-piece footwear were not recognized in Kołobrzeg and in Hedeby. I recognize such fragments of archaic one-piece footwear in unpublished collections from Ribe and Viborg in Denmark. Typical features of the oldest shoemaking stage are the variety of treatments used for better fixing on the leg, better adaptation to the shape of the foot, and obtaining tire seams. This was done through top-down planing of the product and cutting out the leather from the patch according to a specific pattern. In the material from Wolin, I recognized a total of 6 one-piece patterns. The common features were height and fastening with one strap. Similar one-piece forms are known from other early medieval centers. It is worth to mention the selection of stitches, which indicates the lack of uniform rules or principles in footwear manufacturing techniques. In every case I know to me, these stitches required piercing the leather out of the outlet. Next, please. The flexibility of choosing of pattern as well as the sewing methods allows us to assume that one-piece footwear were made by the users themselves on the basis of the traditions passed from generation to generation, perfected as they gain experience and under the influence of external impulses. In the oldest period of footwear development, some local preferences can be observed in the selection of stitches and patterns, which, however, fit in a certain design scheme. For example, the closest to the specimens from Wolin are one-piece footwear from the Danish Viborg. In Staraya Ładoga in Russia, any footwear formed in the part of the heel and front part with special undercuts was not found, and only one such piece from Rurykowe Gorodiszcze is considered is considered to be untypical. Please, next. The one-piece footwear, which is the basis of the reflection on the beginning of the Baltic shoemaking, comes from multicultural centers where appropriate conditions for the development of craftsmanship, including leather manufacturing, were created at an early stage. In these centers, it was possible to produce for specific social groups, for example, for the warriors. It is proved by the discovery of remains of the leather workshop in Wolin, dating back to the second half of the 9th century, which, judging by the shape and amount of the waist, was aimed at producing footwear on a fairly large scale according to unified patterns. The activities of such workshops, known from Hedeby and Stara Ładoga, could significantly influence the process of unification and standardizations of forms, which could take place as early as the mid-9th century. However, the intensive production of footwear was associated with a different type of footwear, with a separate sole added to the variously shaped top. This observation led me to reflect on the origins of directions of development of multi-piece shoes in the western part of the Baltic region. I tried to find an answer to the question of whether advanced single-piece shoes naturally evolved towards the isolation of the sole, or whether they were an imitation of multi-piece forms previously known in other parts of Europe. Please, next. As early as the beginning of the 9th century, in the Baltic Emporia appeared a footwear made up of at least two parts, the sole and the top. The oldest soles tend to be in small pieces and are difficult to distinguish them among threads. Interesting data on this subject was provided by the reanalysis of the collection of leather objects from Santok. This is the stronghold in southern parts of Pomerania. In the material from the second half of the 8th century, I found two fragments of the oldest soles. This does not explain the genesis of the sole as a separate part of the footwear. In my opinion, it cannot be ruled out that in the areas surrounding the Baltic Sea, part of Barbaricum, elements of a developed shoemaking system of a late antiquic civilization may be present, which have been transferred by Germanic tribes who have a direct contact with it. At the meeting point of various traditions and cultures, a new tradition was created, which was preserved for generations to come. The choice and development of shoe forms and types in the Baltic Sea area have undoubtedly been influenced by climatic conditions and the general level of technical skills, including mastery of tanning techniques. It is not possible to exclude the adaptation of external models successfully developed on the basis of local experience, such as the organization of production and the introduction of technological innovations, probably from Arabian areas where leather production had reached a high level early on. Next, please. Changes in footwear made of several elements, at least two, involved the introduction of improvements that increased the utility values and prolonged life of the footwear, but also increased its attractiveness and aesthetics. In the case of Wolin, these were low forms consisting of a sole and two symmetrical parts of the top, which were sewn together along the heel and along the top of the foot, always fixed on the leg with a thong. In my opinion, this three-part shoe was a natural consequence of a one-piece footwear with undercuts modeling the back and the front. It appeared practically everywhere, in most of the early medieval centers known to me, but only in Wolin it had the largest share among early complex forms. Next, please. An important feature of the Wolin's shoemaking from the mid-9th to the early 11th centuries was a considerable conservatism in the choice of forms and construction solutions, which in a way justified the hypothesis of the functioning of the workshop supplying anonymous customers. At the same time, in the 10th century, the Swedish Lund was dominated by footwear consisting of a sole and a one-piece top, which required only one seam along the heel. Characteristic is also the sole, which is finished as the triangle. Such soles were also characteristic for shoemaking from the 8th to 10th century in Hedeby. In Poland, such solutions are extremely rare. So far, no shoes have been found in Pomerania with a top cut together with two stripes, and no tops closed with leather rolled toggle have been found yet, as they are known from Scandinavian towns. Next, please. The variety of constructional solutions for early multi-piece shoes was, in my opinion, mainly due to the search for the most rational forms, starting from the pattern design and stitching applied to the comfort of use and probably also the general appearance. Some elements exceeding the average, especially decoration, indicate the rush to satisfy aesthetic needs, perhaps emphasizing the prestige of the user. The most important thing, however, was, in my opinion, pragmatism, which ascribed improvements and modifications. In the 10th century, in the Baltic region, in shoemaking was introduced a method of construing footwear with a uniform upper. Unlike the upper stitched on the heel or in front, or both those places, the seam always was situated from the inside of the foot. This type of pattern required considerable skills and good knowledge of the properties of the raw material, including the directions of the skin's ductility. As a result, the footwear was more comfortable, as it eliminated the tiresome seam that caused the heel abrasions. Different early single patterns were used in the same time in Russian, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Norse, German, and Pomeranian centers, but everywhere the rear-mounted uppers were gradually replaced by side-mounted ones. This way of design, modified and improved, dominated in shoemaking in the 11th, 12th centuries, and was developed and adjusted to the needs of consumers, including the fantasies of emerging fashion, has survived to this day. In the 11th, 12th centuries, one-piece shoes were almost completely out of use, with the exception of the Russian centers, where they remained for several centuries, the so-called porshny. At the same time, three-parts models with traditional stitches along the axis of the nose were sometimes used, but at the end of the 11th century, they belonged to the archaic type. Regional differences or local tastes were related to the ways of decorating and fixing on the leg. Please next. Since the end of the 11th century, it has been possible to observe the introduction of design solutions which have gained widespread recognition in the Baltic Sea area, both in Scandinavia and on the southern coast. Broader openness to the cultural influences of Western Europe, social and economic changes, and general progress in the various craftsmanship sectors are the main causes of change in the leather sector as well. Since the middle of the 11th century, a tendency to standardize the manufacturing procedures and standardize the form of footwear in most European centers has been recorded. The successful development of leather production would not have been possible without the evolutionary changes in tanning, of course. Periods of improvement in the process of vegetable tanning of hides, which improve their quality, are very difficult to define, if possible at all. In the context of the result of research on leather production, it should be assumed that the medieval tanning has moved from a simple work for the farm and inhabitants' needs through crafting for trade purposes into mass production. The key period turned out to be from the end of the 11th to the end of the 12th century, when craftsmanship were organized within the feudal domain. Early town structures were formed and craftsmen were producing for local markets, and thus the products were clearly unified. The progress in tanning was important for the production of footwear, as it was reflected in the quality differentiation of leather, from very thick for soles to thin and elastic for uppers and inserts. Good knowledge of the tanning properties and individual plant species also contributed to obtain the rind coloring. In the 12th century, footwear production, or shoemaking in fact, definitely entered a new phase of development consisting in consolidating earlier technological and quality achievements. In the perspective of the large collection of leather footwear from various Baltic Sea centers, the variety of types and ways of decoration, the distinction between ordinary footwear and above average specimens, either for festive dress or a specific social group, has become clearer. Essentially, the some uppers differed from each other in terms of their non-structural features, which in my opinion resulted, among other things, from the adjustment of universal patterns used in most workshops to the needs of individual recipients. In the footwear production of a transitional period, by which I mean here the introduction of manufacturing rules defined by the corporation guild lines, the structural innovation introduced in the 12th century were clearly established, while the appearance and the shape of individual components of footwear were subject to changes. These periods of footwear development in the late Middle Ages required a separate discussion. Next, please. At the end, I would like to say that studies on the relationship of medieval footwear with clothing have not been yet a subject frequently researched by archaeologists in Poland. In my research, I tried to focus on this aspect of medieval reality, which required a revaluation of the questionnaire. The issue of manufacturing techniques, which have been clearly petrified since the 12th century, have been preserved, the same as types of wood footwear through the Baltic Sea region. However, the secondary features require detailed consideration. The best result I could achieve by studying the findings from a long period covering several centuries discovered in one town. It seems that at least some of the changes taking place in Pomeranian footwear production in the 12th century can be associated with the reception of Western European fashion patterns. Entering the influence zone of the Latin civilization means, among other things, adopting certain patterns of behavior, including dress and ceremonies, especially in the elite societies. These in turn have been preserved on the monuments of Romanesque art. Most of the time, the costumes from that period can be reconstructed thanks to them. Archaeological sources, including well-preserved leather elements, complement this conclusion very well, especially in the case of footwear, which is usually not visible under the long robe of iconography or is only marked with a darker spot. Changes in clothing around the middle of the 12th century meant the birth of fashion in the sense we know today. In the clearly dominant group of everyday shoes, one can notice elements exceeding average. This is at least how I explain the presence of embroidered top bands, most probably colored ones, which occurred intensively in the short period of time. They refer to Romanesque Western European dress to representative costumes. The increase of decorated footwear can therefore also be considered as a sign of an overall increase in prosperity. Please next. The standards of clothing and costume shaped in the 12th century survived almost 2.5 centuries until about the middle of the 14th century. The flow of ideas and the technology has become more fluid thanks to economic ties and the participation of the Baltic towns in Hanseatic League. Next, please. Based on early medieval material from Szczecin, I found that cutting the footwear according to a particular pattern not always translated into obtaining products which looks identical. I have posed a question to myself if the decrease in a number of stylistic groups in one construction type means the uniformization of production techniques, or is it a symptom of a stabilization of a particular style resulting from the reigning aesthetic norms or even fashion? And next, please. The dynamics of the shoemaking development resulted from the natural tendency towards perfecting products, increasing their utilitarian and aesthetic value. In the course of time, leather footwear ceased to have solely utilitarian function and became a foot element of the clothing, informing about the user's position and financial status. Thank you very much.
Перевести, да? Anna, thank you very much. And now we can make a short translation in Russian of your report.
Me?
Спасибо. Ну, в докладе рассматривалась территория Померании. Здесь представлена периодизация предмета исследования кожаной обуви с территории Южной Балтики. Как видите, 6-7 века – это начало средних веков в Померании и старейшие находки древнейших славянских поселений. 8-9 век – это появление ремесленных традиций в регионе. В XII веке, в эпоху христианскую уже, да, начало христианской эпохи, здесь уже есть раннее государственное образование, и затем речь идет уже о формировании, развитии городов и складывании городских корпораций, городских традиций. Ну и уже XVI век – это период реформации и конец Средневековья. Что дальше? Да. Значит, задачи исследования были рассмотреть разнообразие техник и стилистики кожаной обуви, рассмотреть генезис развития, да, различных элементов кожаной обуви в Балтийском регионе, выделить первоначальный этап изготовления кожаной обуви на Южной Балтике, рассмотреть производство кожаной обуви как ремесленный процесс, да, как производственную организацию, и рассмотреть соотношение различных типов обуви с различными типами одежды. Будьте добры, дальше, пожалуйста. Да, ну, значит, вот здесь как раз демонстрируются древнейшие находки Szczecina и Волина цельнокроенной обуви. Можно, пожалуйста, дальше? Типы швов цельнокроенной обуви из Волина 9-10 веков. Дальше. Да, значит, опять вот, да, модели цельнокроенной обуви 9-10 веков из Волина. То же самое дальше. Значит, древнейшая подошва, уже, значит, краёная обувь, которая датируется второй половиной 8-го, первой половины 9 века из Тантака и Волина. Дальше. Значит, вот трехчастная обувь из Волина, датирующаяся 9-10 веками. Дальше. То же самое, да, находка инситу. Да, значит, обувь с цельной верхней частью, на предыдущем была слайде. Различные типы обуви из Szczecina. Ну и, насколько я поняла из доклада и из текста публикации, что идет развитие кроя обуви, и уже в XII-XIV веках это развитие кроя, оно во многом было, во-первых, оно было очень дифференцированным, и, во-вторых, определялось во многом теми правилами, которые принимались в каждом городе, то есть, значит, вот высокая вариабельность именно этим объясняется, и уже в XIV веке принимались различные нормативы в городах, которые регулировали внешний вид и размеры воротников, шляп, ювелирных украшений, обуви тоже. Значит, вот, соответственно, да, этим объясняется разнообразие. Можно, пожалуйста, дальше? Да, значит, в XII веке распространяется обувь с декоративными швами в регионе Szczecin. Дальше. Да, ну, работа выполнена не только с применением археологических, но и изобразительных источников, как раз из различных городов Померании. Ну, а возвращаясь к заглавию статьи и доклада, удобное или красивое, как я поняла, автор всего лишь, так сказать, ставит вопрос, но не отвечает на него и говорит, что изучение этой проблемы должно быть более детализированным и коллаборации различных специалистов по истории искусства, археологов. Спасибо.
Спасибо, Юлия Владимировна, за помощь в переводе. У кого возникли вопросы?
У меня есть вопрос.
Есть вопросы? Да?
Да, я хочу узнать, это археологические памятники какого типа? Поселенческие какие-то, там погребальные, вот остатки обуви были обнаружены. Это все ровдуга или какой материал? Там речь идет вот о типах памятника и какой материал в основном?
Можно. Это городские материалы. У нас нет такой старых материалов с погребельников. Также это все городские материалы.
И это время какое?
Самые старые, the oldest, from Volin. And recently we found some pieces from 8th century in Santok. Santok is a stronghold.
Спасибо. Понятно.